Welcome back, everybody. Well, today we're having our introduction to Sufism as a tradition of Islamic mysticism. And we left off last time talking about the way in which the Prophet Muhammad's life was exemplary for the Sufis. And I talked about how the Prophet was said to have gone on these retreats every year. And in the course of one of these retreats, spiritual retreat to the cave or the grotto of Mount Hira, the prophet experienced uh, his first revelation in, we think, 610 of the Common Era. And again, the exact form of the story became important for the later Sufi tradition. It is said by his third wife, Ayesha, that Muhammad uh, saw this vision of the angel, and the angel demanded that he read. He replied, "I cannot read." The angel grabs him and squeezes him until he can barely breathe, and makes the same demand again. And Muhammad says again, "I cannot read." And the angel embraces him roughly for the third time, and then conveys from God these words, which form then a chapter of the Quran. Read in the name of your Lord who created the human being from a clot. Read, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught human beings what they did not know. And this notion that God's inspiration, now coming through Muhammad to the rest of humankind, teaches human beings knowledge that they did not previously have. The symbology of the pen, the tablet, all of these things become central to Sufi imagery. One of the great early Sufis was Bayezid Bistami, who belonged to what was considered the ecstatic form of Sufism. There were Sufis who violated social norms, who said things that you couldn't say in polite society. Some of them had what some scholars have called a pantheistic tendency to see God in everything, including in themselves. Bistami was one of those, and it was described how he, in one of the anecdotes about his life, which Sufis later told. Many of these anecdotes are, of course, fabulous, full of miracles and extraordinary events. It is described how Bistami flew to heaven in the shape of a bird and nested in a celestial tree. We saw earlier that there's the imagery in the Quran of the Prophet's ascent to heaven. And so Bistami, as bird, as celestial bird, consumes the fruit of the celestial tree and thereby gains divine knowledge, converses with God. All of this is an imitation of the ascension of the Prophet Muhammad as the Muslim tradition had depicted it. So that's just one example of how the early Sufi tradition drew on these stories about the life of the Prophet to present their image of spirituality. Another feature of Sufism is a special dependence on a certain kind of saying attributed to the Prophet. There are enormous numbers, thousands of sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. And Sahih Bukhari, for instance, is often published in these 6 large volumes. And these sayings are of varying reliability, even according to the Muslim tradition. Some of them are considered to be sound, others are considered to be weak. There's an elaborate science of the traditions in later Muslim thought. I have to say, there is a tendency in contemporary academic scholarship on early Islam to be extremely suspicious of the soundness of these sayings. Most of them don't appear in written form until 200 or 300 years after the Prophet's death, and historians are very suspicious that there was time for the folk process to work on them. If you know the children's game of telephone, or it's called other things in other societies, where one child in a classroom begins by whispering a phrase to another, and they just whisper it one by one to everybody in the class. By the time they get to the last child, the phrase has been mangled beyond recognition. It's been changed. And so historians often are suspicious of oral transmission of these sayings, but they are believed in by, I think, the majority of Muslims. There are a small number of contemporary Muslims who are beginning to question them. In addition to those sayings which have the form of a companion of the Prophet saying, "I heard the Prophet say this," or they have the form of somebody from a later generation saying, "I heard from so and so that he heard from so and so that he heard from so and so that the Prophet said to him that such and such principle was to be implemented." So there are chains of transmission, and the saying is something that Muhammad is alleged to have said. Often there's an anecdote attached to the saying. There is another kind of saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, which are called holy sayings. And these are more like the Quran in the sense that they are in the voice of God. It's God speaking to humankind. And some of these holy sayings are included in the collections of sound sayings. So although the traditionists, the people who transmitted these sayings of Muhammad, and the people who are especially oriented towards that body of religious literature, were often suspicious of the holy sayings. There are some of these holy sayings that were included in the traditional collections. So here's an example of one of the holy sayings that's given in your text by Professor Karl Ernst, and I've worked on the translation. It says, "My servant only draws near to me through that thing that is most beloved to me. That is, the duty I have prescribed to him. My servant continues to draw near to me through extra prayers, supererogatory prayers, until I love him. And when I love him, I become the ear whereby he hears, and the eye whereby he sees, and the hand whereby he grasps, and the leg whereby he walks. If he supplicates me for anything, I give it to him. If he seeks refuge with me, I grant it to him." So again, this doesn't have the usual form of a saying or a hadith attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. It's the voice of God speaking, and there's this breaking down of the ordinary Muslim barriers between the divine and the human, in the sense that there's really a sense of the union of the believer with God. And this saying is therefore widely rejected by more conventional, clerically oriented Muslims, but it is much beloved in the Muslim tradition. Arabic, like Spanish, for instance, or French, tends to favor the masculine gender, and so this has been kept in this translation. But in those languages, Arabic and French and Spanish, when one's talking about a collectivity, the masculine encompasses the female. So it seemed a little anachronistic for the translation to say him or her, or to put it in the plural of they. But it could be done, and it would convey the same meaning. This is for universal. And there's a widespread myth in the West um, that in Islamic thought only women go to only men go to heaven, and this is not true. The Quran talks about entire families going to heaven, and has a high spiritual place for women. At one point, it says that God created the two genders so that people might come to know one another, and it's implied that it's a good thing that there's this kind of gender diversity, which allows for greater human experience and comprehension. This is an example of a holy hadith or holy saying. Another famous one that's much beloved by the Sufis says, "I was a hidden treasure and wished to be known, therefore I created creation and made myself known to them so that they came to know me." Sufis would write commentaries on these kinds of sayings in which they would try to explain them and explicate them for a general audience. In one modern Sufi who died in 1910, Baha'u'ddin al-Bitar of Syria, he interprets it as saying that God in pre-eternity was without mention and not manifested in external reality. He wasn't named by divine names, such as the One. The Quran says God is the first and the last, but his state before creation was first, according to Al-Bitar. And after creation and his having been named by names, then he becomes the last. So in this way of thinking, God has an eternal, ineffable, unknowable essence that before his creation was nameless, was so ineffable that there were no words at all for it. And only with the creation does God come to be named by his creation. And this is a very typical way of Sufi thinking in which God is relational. And it's vehemently rejected by more conventional clerics, or in modern times by the more literal approaches to Islam, characteristic of the Wahhabi and Salafi movements. Another such saying is that the first thing that God created was my light, which originated from his light and derived from the majesty of his greatness. This is Muhammad speaking in this saying. I was a prophet when Adam was between spirit and body. Is another one. Whoever has seen me has seen the truth. I saw my Lord in the most beautiful of forms. Take on the character of God. God is thought to have characteristics, and as we saw before, holy names, and human beings are then being instructed to emulate these. God is the forgiving, therefore human beings should be forgiving, and so forth. And this is another instance of the emulation of Muhammad, or the imitation of Muhammad, as key to the Sufi path. So in this lecture on Sufism, or in these two parts of our first encounter with this tradition, I've tried to tie the later Sufi tradition to the Quran and the biography of the Prophet. And one of the things, and as did Professor Ernst in his book that you're reading, one of the reasons for emphasizing all this, I think, on his part and mine, is that in contemporary academic studies of Islam and Sufism, and in much discourse that one might hear from more literalist or um, conventional clerics, Sufism has often been depicted as something extraneous to Islam. Uh, as a matter of history, I don't believe that that's true. I think there has been from the very beginning a mystical strain in Islam. It was admittedly in the early days much more about asceticism, self denial, vows of poverty, and of moderate living, not chasing after wealth, and so forth. And only later did it become, in some ways, more humanistic and developed a very extensive metaphysics, became imbued very frequently with ideas from Greek Neoplatonism. Um, so it you know developed over time in various ways, but the basics of it really seem to me implicit in the Quran and in the biography of the Prophet, with the idea that there is beyond this material world that we all feel and see with our senses. Um, there is something else. There's a spiritual dimension to reality uh, that can be approached, that does somehow inspire us, that we can hear with that ear and see with that eye if we make the attempt. I think that that notion is implicit in the Quran itself, and so I don't see the Sufi tradition as a departure in any way from Islam. And there was a kind of academic game that was played in the 19th and early 20th century in the Western Academy, in particular, of trying to trace Sufism to some other tradition. To what was it, an influence on Islam of Buddhism, uh, or of Syriac Christianity, as though a rich internal spiritual life was somehow foreign to the Muslim spirit, and so had to be posited as coming from the outside. I don't think it was. Uh, and the other thing to say is that since we're learning all this and trying to concentrate on these matters in the context of a course on happiness, that as with the Buddhist tradition, some of what's being said here is that happiness doesn't lie, as human beings often assume that it must, in in the accumulation of material goods, uh, or in a concentration on achieving greater status among one's peers. And in fact, there's, as we'll see, some parts of the Sufi tradition that um, actively sought a bad reputation. They thought that there was a temptation of pride in living too outwardly an upright life, and they thought that pride was worse than some of the minor sins that one might commit. And in any case, that wasn't the majority of Sufis, but there was that tendency among some of them. So they thought that happiness lies in a rich internal spiritual life, in the acquisition of virtues and the disciplining of the self, which begins as being undisciplined and as seeking carnal pleasures, regardless of the ethics of all that, developing a conscience, and then ultimately mastering the self so as to quiet it down and give it peace, and give up a lot of those cravings and passionate desires that characterize human beings from a Sufi point of view in their state of nature. So that's the introduction that I wanted to give you to this section of the class, and we'll go on then to explore in more detail uh, both the Sufi tradition itself and also uh, the ways in which it intersects with psychology, with positive psychology, and with notions of well-being and the good life. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.